I still check the floor every morning before I stand up. Not the window, not the door, the floor. I do it the same way every time. I wake up, and before my eyes are fully adjusted, before I've registered the temperature of the room or the quality of the light through the curtains, I roll onto my side and I look at the surface beneath my cot. I scan left to right, methodically, the way you would read a topographic grid. I cover every square inch of visible floor within a 3-meter radius of where I sleep. I don't do this because I think I will find something. I do it because I am no longer capable of not doing it. I was a wildlife biologist before I was a ranger. My entire professional life was built around reading surfaces, around understanding what a patch of compressed snow or disturbed soil could tell you about what had moved through it, when, at what weight, in what direction, and with what intent. I spent 11 years learning to read the ground the way other people read faces. I got very good at it. I still am very good at it. That's the part that doesn't let me sleep cleanly anymore. Not what I don't understand, what I understand perfectly. What I brought back from Kessler Divide is not a mystery to me. It doesn't haunt me because it's inexplicable. It haunts me because it is completely, mechanically explicable. And the explanation is worse than anything I could have imagined standing at the equipment locker door on my first afternoon there, reading a laminated card that someone had taped, not slipped in, not filed, taped to the inside of the door, like a warning posted at the entrance to something dangerous. Let me go back to the beginning, before the card, before Kessler, before I understood what fresh prints actually mean in that part of Alaska. My name is Dara Voss. I was a seasonal backcountry ranger with the National Park Service assigned to interior Alaska. Before that, I was a research biologist specializing in large predator movement and winter snowpack analysis. I tracked wolves and brown bears and the occasional mountain lion that had wandered somewhere it had no business being. I read snow for a living. I documented what I found with the precision of someone who understood that a single misidentified track could mean the difference between a correctly mapped territory and a catastrophic management decision downstream. I am telling you this not to establish credentials. I am telling you this so you understand what it cost me to be wrong. People who are merely curious can be wrong without consequence. People who have built their professional identity around being right, around the idea that they can look at a patch of disturbed snow and tell you what made it, and when, carry wrongness differently. It accumulates. It has weight. 3 years before Kessler, I was stationed at Kenai Fjords, conducting a winter predator survey with a research partner named Tom Asher. We were 14 miles from the nearest trailhead when a weather system moved in faster than the forecast had suggested. Tom wanted to begin an early evacuation that afternoon. Standard NPS winter field protocol required us to wait for weather clearance before initiating self-rescue, because moving in deteriorating conditions created greater statistical risk than sheltering in place. I followed the protocol. Tom was found 4 days later. The official ruling classified my decision as procedurally correct. I have read that ruling approximately 40 times. The conclusion has not changed. Neither has my disagreement with it. I transferred from Kenai to get away from a supervisory relationship that had become professionally untenable. A supervisor who knew exactly what I had decided that afternoon and had spent 2 years finding polite, institutional ways to remind me of it in meetings. The Kessler Divide posting was the only winter assignment still available on the board. I requested it without researching it first. That was my first mistake. My second was not asking why a station at 4,200 feet in Rangel St. Elias had been sitting vacant for 11 months. I should have asked that question. I want to be clear about that. The answer was available if you knew where to look. I have thought about this extensively in the months since my extraction. What I have concluded is that I didn't ask because, on some level, I didn't want to know. I wanted a remote posting, winter snowpack work, no supervisory interference, and enough distance from Kenai to stop hearing Tom Asher's voice in the silence before I fell asleep. I got all 4 of those things. I also got 7 rules about fresh footprints. And what came with them? The bush plane that flew me into Kessler Divide was a Cessna 185 on wheel skis, piloted by a man named Chet Durand, who had been flying supply runs into the interior Rangel backcountry for 11 years. He had a gray beard, a methodical pre-flight routine, and the economical manner of someone who had learned long ago that most things people said to each other on small planes were unnecessary. We didn't talk much on the flight in. I watched the terrain change from the lower valley spruce through the timberline zone and up into the open ridgeline country around Kessler Divide, where the forest thinned and the snowfield began, and the world became very flat and very white and very still. The station was visible from the air as a small, dark rectangle on the southern lip of the ridge. Beyond it, to the north, the snowfield extended toward the Kessler Glacier terminus. Maybe 300 meters of open, unbroken white. Chet set the plane down on that snowfield with the matter-of-fact precision of someone parallel parking a vehicle they've driven for a decade. He cut the engine, and the silence that followed was immediate and total in the way that interior Alaska silence always is, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a kind of pressure that fills the space where sound would normally be. He popped the door and began handing gear out to me without getting out himself. Dry bags, equipment cases, food cache containers. He passed each one through the door, and I set them in the snow beside the plane. The whole process took about 12 minutes. When we were done, I looked at the skis and the unbroken snow around them. Chet had not put a single boot print on the snowfield. Everything he'd handed out had come through the door while he remained in his seat. "You're not getting out?" I asked. He glanced at the snowfield. Not at me, at the snow. "I keep my prints off the field," he said. "Personal preference." I waited to see if he would add anything to that. He didn't. He was already pulling the door toward him. "Personal preference from 11 years, I said. He looked at me then, just for a second. "Supply runs in 10 days, he said. "Miss the check-in twice in a row, and I'll contact Katina Dispatch. You've got the emergency beacon. Use it before you need to, not after." He pulled the door shut, and 30 seconds later, the engine turned over, and the plane was taxiing back along its own landing track, which was the only track on the entire snowfield. And then it was airborne, and the silence came back, and I was alone in it. I stood there for a moment, with my gear piled around my boots. The station was 40 meters away. The snowfield was clean in every direction, except for Chet's runway track. No animal sign, no wind disturbance on the surface. The snow had a particular quality to it up here. Fine-grained and compacted by altitude and the lack of warming cycles. The kind of surface that holds an impression with almost forensic clarity. The kind of surface I had spent 11 years learning to read. I picked up my gear and walked toward the station, and did not yet understand that Chet's refusal to step off that plane was the most important piece of information I would receive in my entire time at Kessler Divide. The station was a single, insulated structure in 2 rooms, a main living and operations space with a propane heater, a radio console, a work table, and a cot, and a smaller supply cache room with a reinforced door accessed through the main room. There was also a weatherproof equipment locker bolted to the exterior south wall, accessible from outside. 11 months of vacancy should look a particular way. I've been in vacant backcountry stations before. They smell like cold and rodent activity, and the slow accumulation of dust on every horizontal surface. The door seals dry compress and let in fine particulate. Mice find ways into the food stores. The windows develop frost intrusion along the lower sill edges, where the insulation has settled. Kessler Divide Station looked like someone had left that morning. The floor was clean, not swept recently clean, not approximately clean, genuinely, completely clean, in the way a floor looks when it has been washed on a regular schedule. There was no dust on the work table, no particulate film on the radio console, no evidence of rodent activity anywhere in the main room or the supply cache. The window seals were intact. The frost intrusion was 0. The propane gauge read 80%, which for a station that hadn't been serviced in 11 months, with no occupant running the heater, was not possible. I checked the gauge 3 times. I went through the routine arrival inspection with the methodical habit of someone who does this often enough that the checklist runs automatically in the background while the conscious mind does something else. And what my conscious mind was doing was cataloging anomalies. No dust, no rodents, no seal deterioration. Propane at 80%. Interior temperature when I arrived was 38 degrees Fahrenheit cold, but warmer than an unheated structure at this elevation had any reason to be after 11 months of interior Alaska winter. The emergency beacon was fully charged. The radio console showed no error indicators and connected to Chitina dispatch on the first attempt. I logged all of this in my arrival report with neutral, professional language. Condition of facility. Good. Equipment status. Operational. Propane reserve. Adequate. What I did not write in the arrival report, because I didn't yet have a framework for it, was the thing I had felt when I first pushed the door open and stepped inside. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a temperature change. It was more like the feeling of a room that has been recently vacated. The particular atmospheric quality of a space where the previous occupant left only seconds before you arrived. The air pressure of a door that closed just ahead of yours. I set up my cot, organized my gear, made a first radio contact with Chitina Dispatch, and cooked a meal on the propane burner. The supply cache room was fully stocked. The door to it opened smoothly on well-maintained hinges. Everything was in order. Everything was wrong in a way I couldn't measure. I found the laminated card while I was putting away the propane regulator manual in the equipment locker. It was taped to the inside of the locker door with 2 strips of gray duct tape, one at the top and one at the bottom, applied with the kind of deliberateness that suggests the person who placed it wanted to ensure it would not be accidentally dislodged or overlooked. The lamination was professional, not a home laminator job, but the kind of sealed, durable lamination you find on official NPS resource cards and standardized field protocol sheets. The card header read, Kessler Divide Station Footprint, Documentation and Response Protocols. Below that, 7 numbered rules. I am going to read them to you exactly as they appeared on the card, because the language matters, and because I want you to understand what I was reading before I tell you what I thought of it. Rule 1. If you find a set of fresh tracks leading toward the station that did not exist at your previous perimeter check, log the species and count before approaching. Do not approach the station from the same direction the tracks are traveling. Rule 2. If the track count for a single trail increases between your first and second observation, meaning there are more prints on the same trail than there were before, close and latch all interior doors, and do not open them until the next scheduled radio check-in confirms all clear. Rule 3. If you find human-shaped footprints that are not your own, do not measure them. Do not photograph them. Walk directly back to the station and begin the radio escalation protocol. Any documentation of human unknown prints is grounds for immediate mandatory transfer. Rule 4. If tracks from 2 different species converge on the same point in the snowfield and then continue as a single trail, do not follow the merged trail. Mark the convergence point on your map with the notation CF and maintain a minimum distance of 40 meters from that point for the remainder of your rotation. Rule 5. If you wake and find fresh prints on the interior floor of the station that lead to, but not away from your sleeping position, do not stand up. Remain on your cot. Use the radio without rising. Wait for verbal confirmation from dispatch before moving. The prints will be gone by the time dispatch confirms. Rule 6. If the same set of prints appears at the same location on 3 consecutive days, same depth, same spacing, same direction file, a pattern recurrence report, and request an immediate rotation transfer. Do not wait for the transfer to be confirmed before beginning your exit procedure. Rule 7. Do not, under any circumstances, leave a set of your own fresh prints visible overnight. Before last light, walk the perimeter and personally obscure every print you have made that day. This is not optional. This is not symbolic. This is the most important rule on this card. The card had no authorship signature, no issuing office code, no revision date, no document control number. Every official NPS protocol card I had ever handled in 11 years of field work had all 4 of those things. Their absence here was not an oversight. You do not format a card this carefully, laminate it this professionally, and tape it this deliberately, and then forget to sign it. I read it 3 times. Then I put it in my jacket pocket and went to check the snowfield perimeter before last light. I want to be honest about my first reaction, because I think my first reaction says something important about what kind of person I was before Kessler, and what kind of person I became there. My first reaction was professional skepticism. I am a wildlife biologist with a specialization in large predator tracking. I have a graduate degree in environmental science and 11 years of applied field experience in subarctic ecosystems. I have read hundreds of tracks in hundreds of conditions, and I understand, with a level of precision that is not general, what animal behavior in snow actually looks like. And what the rules described was not that. Rule 2 described a track count increasing on a fixed trail segment. That is not possible. A set of prints in snow is a record of a single passage. The impressions are made at the moment of transit, and they do not change afterward. Wind can soften edges. Thermal cycling can expand or compress depth, but neither process adds new prints to an existing trail. New prints would require a new passage, which would show disturbance in the connecting snow between prints, which would be visible and documentable. Rule 4 described 2 species converging into a single trail. Physically, 2 animals walking in proximity leave 2 sets of impressions. Their gaits, their weight distribution, their stride intervals are different. Even in cases of extreme behavioral overlap, predator following prey, for instance, the individual impressions remain distinct. 2 trails do not merge into one. Rule 5 described prints appearing inside a locked, insulated structure, leading to a sleeping person disappearing before dispatch confirmation. I don't think I need to explain why a wildlife biologist would have professional objections to that particular scenario. And Rule 3, the one that prohibited documentation of human unknown prints, was the one I returned to longest, because every other rule demanded documentation. My entire job function was documentation. The NPS's entire scientific and legal framework for backcountry management was built on documentation. The idea that there was a category of evidence so specific that the appropriate protocol was to deliberately not record it violated every professional principle I held. It felt like institutional cowardice, like someone had encountered something they didn't understand and responded by deciding not to look at it, which I thought was exactly what a bureaucracy would do. I held all 7 rules in my professional skepticism, and I found them wanting. I told myself they were a previous ranger's private anxiety, given official-looking form, a coping mechanism, a superstition dressed in protocol language. I was right about all of my objections. What I did not understand yet was that none of them mattered. What I did not understand yet was that the rules were not written to explain anything. They were written because something required them. And the distance between those 2 things was the distance between the person who walked into Kessler Divide and the person who was eventually flown out of it. The snowfield was clean and undisturbed when I checked at last light. 22 degrees, clear sky, no wind. By morning, that was no longer true. My first full patrol day at Kessler Divide was genuinely good. I want to say that plainly, not as contrast setup, not as the narrative calm before a narrative storm, but because it was true, and because I think the truth of it matters. The snowpack at 4,200 feet on Kessler Ridge in late December was exceptional. 3 weeks without significant new accumulation meant the surface had settled and consolidated into a dense, fine-grained medium that held impressions at a resolution I had not seen since a survey in the Alaska range 4 years earlier. Every animal passage within the previous 48 hours was recorded in it with the precision of a plaster cast. Reading it felt like reading a clean, well-lit document. Wolfpack movement 2 ridges north. 7 individuals traveling northwest. The alpha's stride pattern showing the characteristic right side favoring I'd seen in aging males. The trail was 36 hours old based on edge degradation and the slight wind drift filling the deeper impressions. They were moving away from the station, which was normal and healthy for a pack that large in territory this open. Eastern tree line. Moose, single adult female, browsing pattern along the spruce margin. The toe drag on her back hooves told me she was carrying winter weight, but moving without distress. Trail approximately 18 hours old. Supply cache perimeter. Fox, possibly 2, their overlapping trails suggesting a mated pair running a territory circuit. 11 prints on the primary trail running north to south along the eastern approach to the cache. I photographed it, logged the location against the station's grid reference system, and noted the time. I spent 6 hours on that first patrol, and I was happy for all 6 of them. This is the work. The cold air and the clean snow, and the animal sign that tells you a specific ecosystem is functioning the way it is supposed to function. That is why I do this job. Not the forms, not the radio check-ins, not the bureaucratic machinery of national park management. This, reading the ground, understanding what it says. I came back to the station at midday, ate lunch, filed my morning observation report with Chitina Dispatch, and then went back out for the afternoon documentation pass at 1400. I went to the Fox Trail first. I had photographed the Fox Trail at 0820. The photographs were logged, time-stamped, and attached to the morning report. 11 prints on the primary trail segment, running north to south along the eastern approach to the supply cache. I had counted them twice before photographing, because I always count twice. At 1412, I returned to the same trail segment for my afternoon documentation pass. I counted 17 prints. I recounted. 17. I stood very still for a moment and looked at the trail. Then I put my camera away and crouched down beside the first print and started counting from the northern terminus, moving south, touching the edge of each impression lightly with one gloved finger as I went. 1, 2, 3. I moved through the full length of the trail to the southern terminus. 17. I straightened up and looked at the snow surface around the trail. I was looking for 3 specific things: disturbance in the undisturbed snow between prints, which would indicate a new passage; edge degradation, differences between the original prints and any additions, which would indicate different ages; and gait variation, which would indicate a different animal had walked the same line. None of those things were present. The snow surface between prints was undisturbed. All 17 impressions showed identical edge definition and identical depth, indicating formation at the same time under the same conditions. The gait interval and the toe spread pattern were uniform across all 17, indicating a single animal. The same fox had walked this trail once. There were 11 prints in the morning. There were 17 in the afternoon. The 6 additional prints were not additions to the trail. They were part of the trail. The trail had always been 17 prints long, except that it hadn't been, because I had counted it twice and photographed it. And the photographs showed 11. I took my copy of the card out of my jacket pocket and read Rule 2 again. If the track count for a single trail increases between your first and second observation, meaning there are more prints on the same trail than there were before. It didn't say, if you think the count has increased. It didn't say, if you make an error in counting. It said, increases. It said, more prints on the same trail than there were before. It was written by someone who had already been to this exact point in this exact thought process, and had decided on the other side of it that the language needed to be unambiguous. I had not misread the rule. I had not misread the prints. Both things were exactly what they said they were. And Rule 2 told me exactly what to do. I went back to the station. I closed and latched the main room door. I closed and latched the supply cache door. I checked both latches twice, which was not in the rule, but felt necessary. Then I sat down at the work table with the radio handset in front of me and waited for the 1800 check-in. The propane heater ran its cycle. The radio console's indicator light pulsed its standard green. Outside the window, the light was going flat and gray in the way it does in interior Alaska in December. Not a sunset, so much as a slow, even dimming. The sun somewhere below the ridgeline. The sky the color of old aluminum. I sat with my hands flat on the table, and I did not move toward the supply cache door. Because something was moving on the other side of it. Not a settling sound, not the contraction of cold metal or the expansion of wood framing in temperature transition. I know those sounds with the familiarity of someone who has spent years in backcountry structures and has had to learn the vocabulary of a building talking to itself in cold weather. What I was hearing was weight, distributed, deliberate weight, shifting in a pattern that was not random and not mechanical, the particular quality of something moving carefully in a room it has been in before. It moved twice. Then it stopped. Then there was nothing. I sat very still. My hands were flat on the table. My mouth was dry. The radio console pulsed green. At 1800, the console chirped, and I keyed the handset. Katina dispatch came through clearly, a female voice, the same dispatcher I had spoken to at 0900, running through the standard check-in format. I confirmed my status, logged the afternoon observation data, noted the weather conditions. Kessler, confirm facility status, she said. Facility is secure, I said. All interior doors closed and latched per current protocol. A pause. Not a long one. 2 seconds, maybe 3. The static hiss of the connection in the background. Copy that, Kessler, she said. Kessler logs are in good order. I held the handset. I had not mentioned logs. I had not mentioned documentation. I had not used the word logs in any radio communication since my arrival at this station. It was not in the NPS check-in format. It was not a standard dispatch phrase. I confirmed all clear with dispatch. I released the handset. The supply cache room was silent. When I opened the cache door 10 minutes later, the room was empty and undisturbed. The floor was clean. I stood in the doorway for a long time and looked at it. The next morning's perimeter check at first light showed a set of tracks I had not put there. They came from the northeastern tree line, crossing the open snowfield in a direct line toward the station's east wall. The impressions were deep and evenly spaced, consistent with a large canid wolf weight, or heavier, with a stride interval in the range I had logged for the alpha of the northern pack. But the northern pack had been moving away from the station, not toward it, and their trail was 2 ridges north and 36 hours old. I stood at the edge of the snowfield and read the trail from a distance before I moved. The impressions came from the tree line with a purposeful directness, no wandering, no investigative deviation, no sniff circle behavior. They walked straight to the east wall of the station, and then they stopped. Rule 1 said, "Do not approach the station from the same direction the tracks are traveling." The tracks were traveling east to west, terminating at the east wall. The natural approach to investigate them would be to walk directly from my position on the south side, which would bring me around the southeast corner and put me at the east wall, approaching from the southeast, which was roughly the same direction the tracks were traveling. The rule said not to do that. I went north first. I walked a wide arc along the northern edge of the snowfield, staying well back from the station's footprint, and came around to the north corner of the east wall from the opposite direction. I moved along the east wall from north to south. The tracks terminated at the wall's base. No exit trail in any direction. Nothing circling back. Nothing continuing south. The tracks came from the tree line, walked to the east wall, and ended. I looked at the east-facing window. The exterior surface of the glass was clear. The interior surface was fogged with condensation, a fine, even film of moisture on the inside of the glass, the kind that forms when warm, humid air contacts a cold surface, the kind that forms when something warm has been breathing against the interior of a window. The station had held a consistent temperature of 38 to 41 degrees overnight. Cold, but not warm enough to generate the kind of humidity differential that would cause interior condensation on the window glass. Certainly not without a warm, breathing source immediately adjacent to the interior surface. I stood at the east wall and looked at the fogged glass and the tracks that ended at my feet. I thought about what I would have walked into if I had approached from the southeast, if I had come around that corner the way I would have naturally, following the direction of the trail, arriving at the east wall from the same direction as whatever had made those prints. I stood there for a long time. The cold was working through my jacket. The snowfield was silent in every direction. For the first time since I had read the card, I was not thinking about the rules as bureaucratic overcaution. I was thinking about the person who had written them, and what they must have seen to write Rule 1 exactly the way they had written it. Not a general caution, not a vague instruction to be careful. A specific operational protocol for a specific physical scenario that they had encountered before. A scenario they had survived evidently because they had written the rule down. The northeast tree line was dark and still in the early light. I turned away from the east wall and walked back to the station, approaching from the north. Day 4. Clear sky, -18 Celsius. Wind from the northwest at approximately 8 kilometers per hour. I noted all of this in my morning log before beginning the perimeter check. The snowfield was in excellent condition. The overnight wind had been light enough to leave the previous day's tracks intact without filling them. I found the prints at the northern edge of the snowfield, approximately 60 meters from the tree line. They were bipedal. That was the first thing I registered. Walking on 2 feet, not 4, upright. The impressions showed a heel strike entry consistent with human gait biomechanics, the posterior portion of the impression deeper than the anterior, indicating forward-weighted bipedal locomotion. Human proportioned, adult-sized. Moving in a straight line from the northern tree line toward the station at a bearing that would have brought them directly to the north entrance door. I stopped. I did not approach. The prints were fresh. The edges were crisp, with no wind softening and no thermal rounding. Made within the last 4 to 6 hours, based on surface condition alone, which placed them in the pre-dawn window, sometime between midnight and 0500. Someone had walked from the northern tree line toward my station between midnight and 0500 in -18-degree conditions. As an NPS search and rescue asset, the protocol in that situation is immediate. Unaccounted human presence in winter backcountry at this temperature is a survival emergency by default. I was required to investigate, establish contact if possible, provide assistance if required, and document everything with enough specificity to support a rescue operation if needed. That was not a preference. It was my legal and professional mandate. Rule 3 said, do not measure them. Do not photograph them. Walk directly back to the station and begin the radio escalation protocol. I stood at the edge of the snowfield, 60 meters from the tree line, and I looked at those prints, and I thought about Tom Asher. I thought about protocol. I thought about a ruling that said my decision was procedurally correct. I thought about what it means to follow a rule when a person might be on the other side of it. I thought about 14 -18-degree miles between Kessler Divide and the nearest trailhead. My camera was in my jacket pocket. The prints were 20 meters away. 20 meters of undisturbed snow. I could cover it in 45 seconds. I took the camera out. I had the lens cap off. I had the grid reference for that section of the snowfield plotted mentally against the station map. I was calculating whether to document from where I stood first, establish a wide context shot, and then move in for close detail work. Standard forensic documentation protocol for unknown subject evidence. I have done it hundreds of times. I was one action from pressing the shutter. What stopped me was not the rule. What stopped me was something I noticed while I was calculating my approach angle. The prints had no toe depth variation. Every human footprint in compacting snow shows differential pressure across the 3 primary load points. The heel, where initial strike weight concentrates, the ball of the foot, where mid-stance weight shifts, and the toe area, where push-off force applies at the end of each stride. These 3 pressure zones create a predictable depth gradient across every human print. The heel impression is deepest. The toe area shows the forward compression of push-off. This is not subtle. It is biomechanically fundamental, and it is visible in snow with the right surface conditions. And Kessler's snowpack was the best surface medium I had ever worked with. These prints were uniformly deep across their entire surface. Heel to toe, the depth was consistent to within a millimeter. No differential loading, no push-off compression, no mid-stance weight shift evidence. Something that walks bipedally in a straight line, maintaining a human stride interval and human foot geometry, but applies perfectly uniform pressure across every point of every footfall, is not generating its gait from a human musculoskeletal system. I put the lens cap back on. I put the camera in my pocket. Then I turned around and walked directly back to the station, because that is what Rule 3 said to do. And for the first time since I had read it, I understood that the rule had not been written out of ignorance. It had been written by someone who had stood exactly where I was standing, with exactly the same camera, and had understood exactly what I had just understood, and had made a different decision, and had left a rule behind so that the next person wouldn't have to. I began the radio escalation protocol at 08:47. Katina Dispatch patched me through to a ranger named Elwood Marsh. I had not heard of him. He had clearly been waiting to hear from someone at Kessler. Elwood Marsh had been with the National Park Service for 18 years. He was currently assigned as regional liaison out of Titina, which was a desk job. And from the way he spoke, it was clear this was not a voluntary career transition. He had the measured, unhurried cadence of a person who has decided that speaking slowly is a form of respect for the subject matter, for the listener, and possibly for themselves. He did not ask me to describe what I had found. He asked me a specific series of questions. Were the prints heading toward the station, or away from it? Toward. Were they in a straight line, or a wandering path? Straight. Did the impressions show consistent depth across the full print surface? Yes. Was the stride interval regular? Yes. At what approximate temperature or conditions when I found them? -18. He made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement, and wasn't quite concern, but was somewhere between the two. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for. "You didn't photograph them," he said. It was not a question. He said it the way a person states a fact they are confirming, not discovering, like he was reading from a checklist. "No," I said. I noticed the toe depth uniformity first. Another small sound. This one was closer to relief. "Good," he said. "That's good." A pause, the static hiss of the connection. The toe depth is usually what stops people. Some of them catch it. Some of them don't. I held the handset and waited. "Mr. Marsh," I said, "what stopped you?" The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked the connection indicator. Still green. "Elbow of the foot," he said, finally. "The prints I found, the medial arch area, was concave in the wrong direction. Just slightly. Most people wouldn't catch it in a field documentation scenario. I almost didn't." Another pause. "I'm glad I did." "Why?" He was quiet again. The Chitina dispatch building was quiet in the background. No other radio traffic, no ambient office noise. Either it was very early there, or he had taken the call somewhere private. Because of what happened to the ranger who didn't, he said. Her name was Renata Holm. She had been a seasonal ranger at Kessler Divide 4 years before my arrival, and she had found a set of human unknown prints on her third day and had spent 6 hours documenting them. Elwood told me this in the same measured cadence he used for everything. But there were places in the account where his voice went careful, in a way that was different from his normal caution. Those were the parts I paid most attention to. Renata had been thorough. She had full documentation training. She shot wide-angle context images first, then worked inward to medium and close detail shots, then laid a measurement scale beside each print for forensic comparison. She had 67 photographs by the time she finished, along with written measurements, a GPS-referenced position log, and a hand-drawn stride analysis diagram. She did everything correctly, Elwood said. By the documentation standard, it was an excellent workup. The photographs, he told me, did not come out correctly. She hadn't reviewed them in the field. The light was going by the time she finished, and she'd gone back to the station to upload to the documentation server. When she opened the image files, the prints in the photographs were not the same prints she had photographed. Not dramatically different, not visibly altered. The dimensions had shifted some wider, some narrower, within a margin that would have passed a casual review, but failed under measurement comparison. The depth ratios had changed. The stride interval in the sequence shots showed a variation pattern that was not present in the field. The prints in the 67 photographs were like a copy of what she had documented. An almost correct copy, close enough to be the same thing, and wrong enough not to be. She filed an anomaly report and requested technical support. 30 hours later, the pilot scheduled for an unrelated supply run to a station 20 miles south was asked by Chitina Dispatch to do a welfare check on Kessler Divide. He found Renata inside the station. She was standing at the east wall, facing it. She was unharmed, physically. She had been there long enough that the propane heater had cycled through its reserve twice. She had no memory of the 30 hours. Her camera's memory card was full 67 original images, plus 112 additional images she had not taken, the last 40 of which she refused to look at, and which were subsequently sealed in the file under administrative review. The file was classified. Elwood should not have known any of this. "Why are you telling me?" I asked. "Because you didn't photograph them," he said, "and I need you to understand why that was the right decision in a way that goes deeper than protocol compliance." "What do you mean?" "The documentation teaches it something," he said. "The measurement, the photography, the written analysis, it uses that. Every data point you collect about those prints, it collects about you. Your methodology, your eye level, your documentation sequence. By the time Renata was finished, it knew her process better than she did." I sat with that for a moment. "Before you go," I said, "is there anything else at the station I should know about?" "Check the old log," he said. "Paper 1, in the equipment locker, behind the propane regulator manual. Back cover. Look at the map. He signed off. I sat with the handset in my hand for a moment, and then I got up and went to the equipment locker. The old log was exactly where he said it would be, a standard NPS field observation log, cloth-bound, worn along the spine, tucked behind the propane manual, in a way that wasn't hidden, but wasn't obvious either. The kind of placement that says the person who put it there wanted it to be found by someone who was told where to look, not by someone who wasn't. The interior entries were standard: daily wildlife tallies, weather data, equipment maintenance notes, radio log timestamps, multiple handwriting styles indicating multiple occupants over what I estimated from the date range was approximately 4 years of use. The entries were professionally formatted, consistently thorough, and entirely unremarkable. The back cover had a hand-drawn map. It was a topographic grid of the snowfield and tree line surrounding the station, drawn with the kind of precision that suggests someone with survey training or cartographic experience. The grid lines were tight and even. The station was marked at center south. The compass orientation was noted. Distance scales were hand-calculated in the margin. Scattered across the grid were 6 notations, each one a hand-penciled CF followed by a date. CF was the notation specified in Rule 4, convergence point, the location where tracks from 2 different species converge into a single trail. 6 points, 6 separate dates. The dates were in 4 different handwriting styles, which meant 4 different rangers had added to this map. The earliest date was 9 years ago. The most recent was 11 months ago, the final month of the last occupant's rotation before the station went vacant. I transferred the 6 CF points to my own field map, plotting them against the station's established grid references. Then I looked at what I had drawn. The 6 points clustered in a 200-meter radius around the northeast tree line, exactly as the map showed. But plotted against the station's coordinate system, their arrangement was not random. They described a shape, a rough, imperfect shape, but recognizable if you had any familiarity with architectural floor plans. The shape was the floor plan of the station. The CF points mapped the exterior geometry of both rooms, the supply cache doorway, and the north entrance. I sat down on the equipment locker step. 4 rangers over 9 years, on 4 separate occasions, at 4 separate times, had each found a species convergence point at a location that corresponded to a specific structural feature of the building they were occupying. None of them had communicated with each other. None of them, based on the absence of any reference in the interior log entries, had written about what they had found. They had each come independently to the back cover of the log and added their notation to the same map. Whatever was making the CF points was not mapping the snowfield. It was mapping the station. And with 6 points placed, the map was nearly complete. I read every interior entry surrounding each CF date. I was looking for any reference, even oblique, even personal, to what each ranger had seen on the days they added their notation to the back cover map. There was nothing. On the date of the first CF notation, 9 years ago, the log entry for that day read, "Wolf activity, northeast corridor, 2 individuals. Weather clear. Radio operational. Propane reserve, 70%. That was the entire entry for a day when that ranger had walked to the back cover and added the first mark to a map they had started from scratch, which meant they had already conceived of the mapping system, which meant something had already happened before that date that made them want to create it. Whatever had happened was not in the log. On the date of the 4th CF notation, 5 years ago, moose, single adult, male, eastern tree line, fox activity, cache perimeter, visibility good, equipment check completed. The entry was professionally formatted and entirely, conspicuously normal. On the date of the 6th and most recent notation, 11 months ago, the entry for that day was 3 words: perimeter check completed. That was it. The last entry before the station went vacant was 3 words, and whoever wrote it had first gone to the back cover and added the 6th mark to the map, placing the notation for the north entrance, which was the final structural feature that had not yet been documented. They had completed the map, and then they had written 3 words in the log, and then the station had been vacant for 11 months. I thought about what it means when a person decides to stop writing things down. In my experience, in 11 years of field work, people stop documenting for 2 reasons. The first is that they believe the documentation is no longer useful. The second is that they believe the documentation is no longer safe. The rules, specifically Rule 3, told me which of those reasons applied here. And the missing authorship on the laminated card told me that the same reasoning applied to the rules themselves. The card had been written by someone who understood that certain kinds of documentation are not neutral, that the act of recording some things in this specific location was not information gathering. It was communication. And they had written the rules in the most official-looking format they could manage, without signing them, without dating them, without a document control number, because putting their name on them would have been the same kind of mistake Renata Holm had made with her camera. I closed the log and returned it to its place behind the propane manual. I stood in the equipment locker doorway for a moment, looking at the east wall of the main room. Then I looked at the window. The light outside was going. The northeastern tree line was a dark line against a gray sky. At the base of the tree line, where the open snowfield met the first edge of the spruce, the shadows were dense and still, except that they weren't entirely still. Something in the shadow line was moving with a quality that was different from wind movement, different from the settling of snow off branches. Something slow and deliberate and low to the ground. I turned off the equipment locker light and went inside. Day 6 began at 0640 with a clear sky and minus 21 Celsius. And by 1100, it had produced 3 separate rule activations in 4 hours, which was more operational pressure than the previous 5 days combined. The first one I found at 0720 on the eastern approach trail along the cache perimeter. The fox prints from day 1, the trail I had counted and documented at 11 prints on my first patrol. The trail that had shown 17 on the afternoon return were there again. Same location, same orientation, same general gait pattern. 3 consecutive days now, same location, same trail. Rule 6 required me to file a pattern recurrence report and request an immediate rotation transfer. I filed the report at 0800. The request went to Dutina Dispatch with a routine confirmation timestamp. I noted the filing time and began tracking the response window. The second activation came at 09:15 in the northeastern quadrant of the snowfield. I found a moose trail and a wolf trail converging into a single set of impressions at a point 60 meters from the supply cache. Same phenomenon as Rule 4 described. 2 separate species, 2 separate track patterns, merging into a single unified trail at a precise point and continuing as one. I marked the convergence point as CF on my field map and stepped back to calculate the 40-meter exclusion perimeter. The CF point was 60 meters from the cache. The exclusion perimeter would put the boundary of the restricted zone at 20 meters from the cache. The cache access door was on the eastern face of the supply room. I could still reach it, but only from a specific angle, and only if the restriction held to the geometric minimum. CF points had a way of multiplying at Kessler. I knew that now. The third activation I didn't identify until 1100, when I walked the morning's full trail circuit for the second documentation pass and reviewed the perimeter check log against my photographs. I had missed a print. Near the north entrance, at 17:48 the previous evening, during my last light obscuring walk, I had come around the corner of the station and started my perimeter sweep from the east side. In the low light and the cold, moving efficiently to finish before full dark, I had begun my sweep 6 meters further along the north face than my normal start point. The 6 meters I had missed contained a single partial boot print. My right boot, heel, and outer edge, the entry stride from when I had approached the north entrance at 16:30. The print had been visible overnight. I had violated Rule 7. Not deliberately, not carelessly by the standard of any reasonable field judgment call. But the rule did not include reasonable field judgment as a mitigating factor. The rule said, do not leave prints visible overnight. The print had been visible overnight. I stood at the north perimeter and looked at the 14 hours that had passed since last light, and understood that whatever the consequence of that oversight was, it was already in motion. I couldn't go back. I couldn't obscure a print that had already served its purpose. I went back inside and waited for the pattern recurrence report response. It did not come at 1 hour. It did not come at 4 hours. It did not come at 8 hours. I filed a follow-up at 1600 and logged the delay. The follow-up confirmed receipt of the original report and provided no timeline. I cooked a meal I didn't taste, checked every door latch, and sat down with the laminated card. The pattern recurrence report response came at 22:14, 14 hours and 14 minutes after I had filed the original request. It came through on the main console, not through Katina Dispatch's standard relay. The voice identified itself as Regional Administrative Coordination, which was a designation I had seen on internal NPS paperwork, but had never heard on a field radio channel. The frequency was correct. The authentication protocol format was correct. The voice was calm, professional, and female, with a slight telecommunications system flatness to the audio quality that was consistent with a relay bounced through multiple repeater stations. She confirmed receipt of my pattern recurrence report for the Kessler Divide posting. She confirmed that my rotation transfer request was being processed. She provided a preliminary transfer timeline of 72 hours, contingent on weather clearance at the Kessler Snowfield landing site. I confirmed receipt and began to close the exchange. "One more thing," the voice said. "Your current supervisor, Director Welland, has been notified of the transfer request per standard personnel protocol." I held the handset. Director Welland, the full name, first name, and title. I had never referenced my supervisor in any Kessler radio communication. I had not listed her in my arrival report. Her name did not appear anywhere in the station's existing documentation, because station-level personnel records don't carry supervisory chain information at the field radio level. The only way to connect my name to Director Welland's name was through internal NPS personnel records, which were not accessible through the field radio frequency. I asked the voice to confirm their dispatch identification number. They provided it. It was the correct format, the correct digit count, the correct regional prefix. I confirmed the exchange and set the handset down. I sat very still. The radio console pulsed green. The propane heater ran its cycle. The main room was quiet in the way it is only in interior Alaska in deep winter. A silence with physical density. A silence that has weight. I thought about what Elwood Marsh had said. Every data point you collect about those prints, it collects about you. I had not collected data about the prints. I had been careful. I had followed Rule 3. But there were other ways to learn a person. Radio communications, filed reports, arrival documentation, the ongoing record of daily check-ins, each one containing my voice, my phrasing, my operational vocabulary, my supervisor's name, appearing in a transmission context I had not authorized, from a frequency I could not verify was who it said it was. I thought about Rule 5, the one about interior prints, the one that said to use the radio without standing. I had always read that rule as a protocol for managing physical proximity the entity in the room, the radio as a fixed point, the instruction to stay still as a way of not triggering a response, but sitting in that chair with the handset on the table in front of me. I began to wonder if the radio itself was part of what the rule was managing. Not just the entity in the room, the possibility that the radio was not entirely a safe channel. The transfer was not coming in 72 hours. I understood that, with a certainty, I could not have explained to a review panel. The weather window would close, the timeline would extend. Katina Dispatch would continue to confirm all clear. I was going to be at Kessler for however long this was going to take. I found it at first light on day 7. From the northern tree line, a trail crossed the open snowfield and stopped 18 inches from the station's north entrance door. That was the distance. I measured it with my eyes, which I trust in this context. 18 inches, less than half a meter. From the door I use every day. The trail came from the tree line in a straight line, and it was not the uniform depth bipedal prints I had found on day 4. It was something else. It had a wider base than a human stride, and the impressions were irregular in shape, not animal species irregular, but structurally irregular, as if the weight distribution was shifting continuously between contact points in a pattern that didn't match any gait I had ever read. I did not have a field guide entry for it. I did not have a professional comparison point. but it had followed my unobscured print trail exactly. My right boot heel, the partial impression I had left at the north entrance the evening before, the trail came from the tree line and aligned with that impression with a geometric precision that was not coincidental. It had used my print as a bearing, a destination address. It had followed my trail home. It stopped at 18 inches, not at the door, not at the wall, 18 inches from the entrance. I stood inside the station and looked at it through the window for a long time. The cold worked through the glass. The snowfield beyond the new trail was undisturbed in every other direction. I thought about Rule 7's language. This is not optional. This is not symbolic. This is the most important rule on this card. The person who wrote that had known what would happen if you left your prints overnight. They had been precise about what it meant, not a general caution, not a symbolic gesture, a specific operational protocol with a specific physical consequence. And I had missed one print in the dark, and the consequence had arrived before first light and stopped 18 inches from my door and waited there to be found. It was not threatening. That was the part I kept returning to as I stood at the window and looked at it. It was not a predatory posture. It was not circling behavior, not a charging or rushing approach. It had followed my trail to its end point and stopped. Precisely. It had done what the trail indicated was possible, and then it had not exceeded what the trail indicated was possible. It had done exactly what the trail told it to do. No more. No less. That night, I went to bed knowing the transfer was not coming in time, knowing the entity knew where the door was, and running Rule 5 through my mind like a procedural checklist I was memorizing for an exam I didn't know when I would have to take. I prepared for that night, the way I imagine certain people prepare for surgery, with a deliberate, methodical attention of someone who understands exactly what is at stake and has decided that precision is the only form of control still available to them. Propane, checked. Full reserve. Heater cycling normally. Radio, charged, operational. Handset positioned on the work table at arm's reach from the cot. Main room door, closed and latched. Supply cache door, closed and latched. Equipment locker, exterior, secured. I checked both interior latches twice. Then I did the perimeter walk. I started from the east corner this time, specifically choosing a starting point that would guarantee complete coverage of the north face. I moved with a flashlight held low, reading my own boot impressions in real time as I made them, and confirming as I went that no patch of the perimeter was going unobserved. It took me 40 minutes. It normally takes 20. I did not shorten it. Every print I made during that walk, I obscured on the second pass. I used the heel of my boot to compress and smooth each impression, working backward along my own trail. By the time I finished, the perimeter snow around the station showed no human boot pattern in any direction. Clean, undisturbed, no address to follow. I went inside. I ate something. I sat at the work table and read through the laminated card one more time. All 7 rules, in order. The way you run through a pre-flight checklist, not because I didn't know them, because I needed to hold them in the order they were written, to feel their sequence, to understand which ones were likely to activate first and which ones were designed to manage a situation that had already progressed past the earlier rules. Then I lay down on the cot with my jacket on and my boots on and the radio handset on the mattress beside me, and I watched the ceiling, and I did not sleep. The snowfield was still. The tree line was dark. At 2300, the wind came up from the northwest and moved through the upper spruce and made a sound that was only the wind, only the trees, entirely explicable. And I lay still and listened to it, and categorized it as normal, and felt my heartbeat stay where it was. I woke at 3:14 a.m., not gradually, all at once, like a switch, present and oriented, without the usual transition through grogginess, fully awake the way you are only when something has woken you, not when your body has finished sleeping. I had not finished sleeping. I did not sit up. I rolled to my side and looked at the floor. The prints led from the east wall to my cot. They were on the interior floor of the station, on the clean-swept wood surface I had documented as unmarked when I went to bed. They came from the base of the east wall, from a point roughly below the east-facing window, and they traveled in a straight line to the foot of my cot, and then turned and came along the cot's side and stopped at a point approximately level with my shoulder. I looked at them without moving. I was on my side, propped on one elbow, my other hand already moving to the radio handset beside me. The prints were not animal, and they were not precisely human. They had the general geometry of a bipedal stride, two-footed, upright, forward progressing, but the individual impressions were wrong in the same way the exterior prints had been wrong. Uniform depth across the full surface. No differential pressure loading. I did not stand up. I keyed the radio handset lying on my side, reaching across my body to the console without rising. The handset was already on the frequency. I pressed the transmit key and gave my station identifier and requested confirmation. The response from Katina Dispatch was 22 seconds. The standard response time I had logged across every previous check-in was 3 seconds. I had 11 data points. 3 seconds every time, within a 1-second variance. The 22-second delay was not a transmission problem. There was no static, no relay dropout, no signal quality change. The channel was open. Someone was deciding how to answer. At 22 seconds, the dispatcher came through. Calm, professional, the standard confirmation format. All clear, Kessler. All clear. I set the handset down and waited. The prints were gone. I did not see them disappear. There was no moment of transition. I looked at the handset. I looked back at the floor, and the floor was clean. The straight line from the east wall to my cot was unmarked wood, exactly as it had been when I went to bed. But my wool blanket was folded down to my waist with geometric precision. I had pulled it to my chin when I lay down. It was now folded in a crisp, even horizontal line across my abdomen, with both corners turned under, the way you might fold a blanket on a bed you were making. Not thrown back, not displaced, folded, intentionally, carefully folded, while I was lying under it. I lay on my back and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the wind had stopped. Between 3:14 a.m. and 5:40 a.m., every remaining rule activated. At 3:47, I did a visual check from the window without opening it. The north snowfield showed a new set of tracks approaching from the west, from the direction I was standing. I was standing at the north window. The tracks were approaching from the west, and their trajectory would bring them to the north wall at my current position. Rule 1. I moved to the south end of the main room and did not return to the window. At 4:15, lying back on the cot, I heard the fox trail from the eastern approach in my mind's eye, and knew without going to check that the count had increased again. Rule 2 was still active from the previous day's activation. All interior doors were already latched. At 4:33, I heard the radio. Not the console's standard check-in chirp. The handset, which was beside me on the mattress, produced a single broken transmission, a half-second burst of voice, too short for full comprehension, but long enough for one word. The word was a nickname. A specific nickname that no one at this station, or at Chitina Dispatch, or in any NPS personnel record had any access to. A name that Tom Asher had used for me, informally, in the field, during 2 years of shared research work, and that I had not heard from any other source since the official notification of his death arrived in my Kenai Station inbox on a February morning 3 years ago. I heard it clearly, one time, in a voice I could not identify with certainty in a single half-second transmission, but that carried a tonal quality in the register of someone I had known. I put the handset face down on the mattress. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, and I stayed exactly as still as Rule 5 had required me to stay when the interior prints were on the floor. I controlled my breathing. I kept my hands flat. I ran through all 7 rules in sequence, checking which ones were active, which ones I was in compliance with, which ones I was managing, and which ones I was simply enduring. I followed every rule, every single one. When the rules contradicted each other's spatial requirements, I defaulted to the higher numerical rule, which appeared to be the intended priority system based on the card's formatting. When one activation required movement and another required stillness, I defaulted to stillness, because the rules that required immobility seemed to be the ones written with the most specificity, which I had learned to interpret as an indicator of which behaviors carried the greatest consequence if violated. At 5:40 a.m., the quality of the darkness outside the window changed. The gray pre-dawn light began at the tree-line horizon. The snowfield went from black to a flat, featureless silver. I sat up. The floor was clean. The window was clear. The radio console was dark and quiet. The station was exactly as I had left it the night before, minus the wool blanket's altered position, which I had not moved. I sat on the edge of the cot for a long time, and then I understood what the rules had actually done. The rules are not deterrents. I want to say that as plainly as I can, because I spent the first several days at Kessler treating them as deterrents, as a set of behaviors designed to discourage contact, reduce engagement, minimize the risk of an encounter. Like bear precautions, like protocol for managing a territorial predator. Keep your distance, make noise, don't provoke. That was not what they were. Sitting on the edge of that cot in a pre-dawn quiet, with the blanket folded across my waist, and the floor clean and the radio silent, I worked through what had happened across 7 days with the same methodical attention I would give to a field observation dataset. I looked at what had occurred, what had not occurred, what the rules had produced, and what they had prevented. Nothing at Kessler had tried to harm me. This is a fact. Nothing in those 7 days had produced injury, had produced a direct threat, had made any move that could be characterized as predatory or aggressive. The new trail from the tree line had stopped at 18 inches from the door. The interior prints had led to my cot and stopped. The radio transmission had been a single word, and then silence. What had occurred every day in methodical progression was contact within defined parameters, approach to a specific distance, entry to a specific point, communication at a specific threshold. The rules defined those parameters, not for my safety, not to protect me from the contact. The rules defined the parameters of the contact itself. They described the boundaries that had been negotiated not by me, not by any ranger I knew of, but by someone or something that had produced the card and the parameters and the operational framework within which every ranger at Kessler Divide since then had existed. The rules kept the ranger alive, not by preventing contact, but by ensuring the ranger behaved within the boundaries the entity had established for contact. Compliance with the rules was compliance with the entity's framework. The rules were a behavioral compact, written in the format most likely to produce consistent adherence from a trained NPS field professional. They worked because they were written for people like me. People who follow protocol. People who have learned, sometimes at great cost, that the protocol exists for a reason. The card had no authorship signature, no issuing office, no revision date. I had thought those omissions meant the rules were unofficial. I now believed they meant the rules were dictated. The folded blanket stayed with me longest. Every other phenomenon at Kessler could be framed, however inadequately, within a predator territory model. Approach behavior, boundary testing, perimeter mapping. The CF cluster that traced the station floor plan was territorial reconnaissance. The track count increases could be read as a population census of observation frequency. The radio transmissions could be interpreted as communication signal testing. But the blanket was folded with geometric precision while I was lying under it. Whatever had been in that room at 3:14 a.m. had not attacked me, had not threatened me, had not communicated in any way that would register as aggressive. It had folded my blanket. It had done so with a precision that implied attention, that implied care for the quality of the fold, that implied the result mattered to whatever was doing it. I have thought about this more than I have thought about anything else from Kessler, including the radio transmission with Tom's nickname, which I have tried to approach clinically and only partially succeeded. The entity was studying human occupancy, the sleep cycle, the respiratory pattern, the behavioral response to rule activation, the emotional response to acoustic stimuli, the decision-making process under multi-protocol pressure. Renata Holmes' documentation had taught it her methodology. The previous ranger's track observations had taught it the building's geometry. My 7 days of rule-compliant behavior had taught it, I don't know exactly what, the specific behavioral profile of a person who follows protocol, even when the protocol costs them something real. The blanket was not data collection, or it was data collection of a different kind. It was a test of proximity tolerance, a measurement of how close it could be without activating a response, a calibration point. I thought about what comes after calibration, in research terms, in behavioral modeling terms. Once you have your subject's baseline tolerance established, once you have their spatial responses mapped, and their acoustic triggers identified, and their occupancy patterns recorded, what is the next phase? Chet Durand landed at 0830. He kept the plane running and handed my gear out through the door without stepping onto the snow. I climbed in. As we lifted off the snowfield and the station grew small below us, I looked at the northeastern tree line. The snow at the tree line edge was undisturbed in every direction, clean, unbroken, as if nothing had been there. I looked at it for a long time. Does anyone ever get hurt at Kessler? I asked Chet over the engine noise. He flew for a moment without answering. No, he said. That's what worries me. I filed my full report within 48 hours of extraction. I am not a person who omits things from official reports. I have seen what omission costs, and I have no patience for it. So I documented everything: the increasing print counts, the CF convergence points, and their geometric arrangement, the interior prints and their characteristics, the radio transmission with the accurate reference to my supervisor's name, and the folded blanket. I documented it precisely and completely in the language of an NPS incident report, which is a form of professional self-defense. If you write it in the right format, using the right terminology, referencing the right procedural frameworks, it is difficult for an institutional reader to dismiss it as personal distress or field disorientation. It reads as observation, not experience. I have learned to write that way. My supervisor, Director Welland, whose name had come through on a radio channel that should not have known it, reviewed the reports within the week. She scheduled a follow-up evaluation. 2 days later, the evaluation was reclassified from standard incident review to administrative wellness assessment, which in NPS bureaucratic language means the decision has already been made, and the assessment is a formality. The follow-up was quietly canceled 3 days after that. The Kessler Divide posting was relisted as vacant on the regional assignment board within the month. I checked it. I check it regularly. It fills and empties on a rotation cycle that is shorter than any other remote backcountry posting in the Rangel system. The occupancy gaps are inconsistent, sometimes 2 months, sometimes 11. The pattern, if there is one, is not obvious from the external listing data. My reports are in the file. I know they are in the file because I have the submission receipts. I also know they are in a file that is classified at a level that took me 4 months of administrative inquiry to confirm even exists. What I cannot confirm is whether anyone in that administrative chain has read the reports and understood them, or read them and decided not to understand them, or read them and understood them perfectly and decided to do exactly what the system has always done with Kessler Divide. Keep the posting filled, keep the behavioral compact running, keep the station occupied. I don't look at surfaces the way I used to. I mean that in a specific, operational sense. I used to look at a snow surface or a soft ground trail and read it as a record of the past, What came through here? When? Moving in what direction? Toward what purpose? The ground as historical document. That is the foundation of wildlife tracking, and it is how I was trained and how I worked for 11 years. I now look at surfaces as predictive data, not because I chose to reframe my methodology, because I cannot stop reading them that way. My visual processing of any unmarked surface now runs a secondary analysis. I did not install, deliberately, a scan for what the surface is prepared to receive, what prints it would hold, how long, in what resolution, whether the surface is the kind that would give directions to something trying to find its way back. I started obscuring my prints in the parking lot at the Chitina field office 2 days after extraction. Not the snowfield adjacent lot, the asphalt lot. I was walking to my truck, and I looked back at the marks my boots had left in a thin layer of accumulated grit and meltwater film on the asphalt surface, and I found myself moving back along them and disrupting each one with the toe of my boot before I got in the truck. It was approximately 40 seconds of behavior that served no rational purpose, and that I performed with the calm, habitual efficiency of something that had been running in the background long enough to feel normal. I do it consistently now. Soft ground, packed dirt, fresh snow, damp concrete. Anywhere a boot leaves a clear impression. I am methodical about it. I don't rush. I go back and confirm coverage the way I confirmed the Kessler perimeter on the night before my extraction. I know what this looks like. I have a reasonable professional understanding of the behavioral alteration framework within which this activity falls. I am not unaware that following a survival protocol outside of the operational context that generated it indicates that the protocol has become internalized at a level deeper than conscious choice. I am not sure at this point that it matters whether I chose it. There is one thing I have not told anyone. Not Director Welland, not the administrative review file, not Elwood Marsh when he called me 2 weeks after extraction to ask how I was doing, which was a question he asked in the careful way of someone inquiring about a specific thing rather than a general condition. On my final morning at Kessler, before Chet's arrival, I went to the equipment locker to return the old log to its position behind the propane manual. I wanted to leave it as I had found it. I opened the locker door and crouched down to place the log on the lower shelf. The locker floor was dusty. This struck me immediately, and wrongly, because the locker floor had been clean when I arrived. The entire station had been clean, conspicuously, impossibly clean, and I had noted it in my arrival log and had not been able to explain it. 7 days later, the locker floor had a thin layer of the fine particulate dust that accumulates in enclosed spaces over time, as if the cleaning, whatever had maintained it, had stopped. In the dust on the locker floor were 2 sets of boot prints. One set was mine. I recognized my boot's tread pattern immediately. The specific wear pattern on the outer heel of my right boot. The particular impression of the left boot's ball area tread, which had been resoled once and had a slightly different depth profile than the original. I had been in this locker multiple times. The prints were mine. The second set was identical to mine. Same tread pattern, same wear indicators, same heel impression on the right boot, same ball area depth differential on the left. Same size, same stride interval for the 2 steps visible on the locker floor. Same depth, indicating identical weight distribution. I crouched in the doorway of the equipment locker and looked at 2 sets of boot prints on a dusty floor, one of which I had made, and one of which I had not. And I thought about Elwood Marsh telling me that every data point you collect about those prints, it collects about you. I had not collected data about the prints, but I had walked this station for 7 days. I had walked the perimeter twice daily. I had stood at the east wall and the north wall and the supply cache door. I had paced the main room at 3:14 a.m. in a dark station in -21-degree weather. I had left my print profile everywhere for 7 days on the surface that holds impressions with forensic clarity. I placed the log on the shelf. I closed the locker. I stood in the pre-dawn quiet and waited for the sound of Chet's engine. There is an 8th rule. It isn't on the card. I believe it isn't on the card because no one who discovered it was in a position to add it. The card is a document of survival rules, written and laminated and taped inside a locker door by people who lived through specific things and encoded what they had learned into operational protocol. The 8th rule describes what happens after you leave, after the laminated card is behind you, after the snowfield is 40 miles back and the bush plane has landed in Katina and you are filling out your extraction paperwork in a warm building with other people around you. The 8th rule is this: once it has your print profile, the station boundary no longer applies. I don't know this from a card. I know it from the logic of everything I understand about how this thing operates. It navigates by prints. Fresh prints are an address. Your print profile is a permanent address. An address you leave on every surface you walk across for the rest of your life, on any surface capable of holding an impression. I check the floor every morning before my feet touch it. I scan left to right, methodically, the way I was trained to read a grid. I cover every square inch within 3 meters of where I sleep. I have not found anything. I want to be clear about that. Every morning, the floor is clean. Every morning I look, and the surface is undisturbed, and I stand up and go about my day with a particular quality of relief that is only available to people who have genuinely needed to check. But the reason I check is not because I think I will find something. The reason I check is because I understand now that the snowfield at Kessler Divide was not the operational boundary. It was the place where the observation was conducted. The research station, in the truest sense of the term, was not the building. The building is portable. The building is wherever the subject goes next. You wanted to know what happened at Kessler Divide. That is what happened. I check the floor every morning. So far, that has been enough.